The proclamation of the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they assembled in a body, and one of them, a lawyer, in an attempt to trip him up, asked him, "Teacher, which commandment of the law is the greatest?" Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart, with your whole soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments the whole law is based, and the prophets as well." The Gospel of the Lord.
Our Gospel for this Sunday comes from the 22nd chapter of St. Matthew. And it is a wonderful culmination of the first two readings, all about love and the commandment of love. In the first reading from Exodus, we see God commanding Israel, the people of the covenant, to love, especially the poorest of the poor, the widows, the orphans, those who have nothing, and the foreigners, those who cannot depend on anyone, who have no one to depend on except God. And God takes their side. But love, the commandment of love in the first reading, is expressed negatively. Do not do anything to harm the poor. This is how you show love, by avoiding actions, things, thoughts, machinations that will worsen the situation of the poor. But in the second reading, we find St. Paul giving us an example of love of neighbor, quite positive. Not just avoiding harmful things, but doing something. And St. Paul did this loving action of sharing the Word of God, the word, the message of good tidings, the gospel, to the Thessalonians. And through his love of the Thessalonians fell in love with God. They left their worship and service of false and dead gods in order to give themselves in love to the true and only living God. Now they have hope in Jesus. They have discovered the God of Jesus, the one who truly deserves their worship, their adoration, and their service. Love of neighbor leading to love of God. Now, in the Gospel, Jesus was being tripped again by the question. The Pharisees rendered to him a question: what is the greatest of God's commandments? What is the greatest of God's commandments? If I put myself in the place of Jesus as a Jew, my instinct would be to go to the 10 Commandments. Because the Decalogue, as we call it, the 10 Commandments are directly coming from God through Moses. And as a pious Jew, I would go back to the 10 Commandments as the greatest of the commandments. But of course, we know that in the Pentateuch, Moses and the people Israel delineated the 10 Commandments. And so you end up with more than 600 precepts. All of them extensions, as it were, of the 10 Commandments and elucidations, explanations, exposition of the contents of the 10 Commandments. But if you have 600 of them, how do you choose which of them would be the greatest of the commandments? But look at the genius of Jesus. He knows the law, he has studied scriptures, and he is able to go to the core. And he says, the greatest of the commandment is, you shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart, with your whole soul, and with all your mind. And then he adds that the second commandment is like the first. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. From the 600 or so commandments, Jesus took these two and brought them together to form what he calls the foundation of the law and the prophets, the foundation of the covenant, and the foundation of our renewal as a people, love of God and love of neighbor. But if we refer this to the first reading from Exodus, we see a difference. The first reading expressed the commandment of love negatively. Do not do this. Do not oppress. Do not extort. Here, Jesus presents the greatest commandments positively. Love your neighbor. Love God. And look, love God, the Lord your God, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all of yourself. Meaning, positively, love is giving of self. It is not just avoiding things that will hurt others. Yes, you keep on avoiding things that will hurt God. But what have you done for God? Have you given yourself to God? And because it is God that I must love, God deserves the whole of me. God is all-encompassing. And so God deserves all-encompassing love. All of me, my whole life, my whole soul, my whole strength, my whole mind will be consciously given to God. But that is tied by Jesus to a second commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we know how we love ourselves. We love ourselves totally. We will pamper ourselves. We give to ourselves the best. That is how we love ourselves. We even preserve ourselves. But if we are not careful, love of self might become preoccupation with self. It might become selfishness. That's why love of self is the basis of love of neighbor. What you will do to preserve yourself, do as well to your neighbor. Wow. Jesus is not telling us to stop loving ourselves, but to make that love of self similar to the love that we will give to our neighbors. And we see already in St. Paul's letter, the second reading, how this love of self and love of neighbor will manifest total love of God. Love of neighbor reveals to our neighbor God who is love, the God who gives Himself totally to us. Let us, in our love of neighbor, proclaim the true and living God, the true and living God that we have discovered, the true and living God that we love. And having loved God, we now make that love manifest to others. Let us not deprive others of the love of God, of the face of God. Let this be our greatest manifestation of love for God and neighbor. Let the face of God, who is love, be seen by others in our selflessness and in our active, proactive giving of self to others. Yes, avoid hurting others, but more than just avoiding harmful actions, do something. Give yourself to others as you give yourself to God. Dear brothers and sisters, I just received a bombshell in my own life. I was just recently given a new mission as the Archbishop of Manila. Way beyond my expectations, and from my self-knowledge and self-estimation, this mission is much heavier than what I can handle. No, it's overwhelming. I cannot imagine how a person like me, with my limitations, with my own weaknesses and my sinfulness, could embrace such an immense mission. But it is a real test of love. I consider it not so much a test of talent or a test of capacity, but it is a calling to love. Can I say yes and give my soul, my mind, my strength to God who has loved me first? And can I love neighbors, even those to whom I'm not related, especially the poor, the teeming masses of the poor in Manila? Could I love them as I love myself? I hear this calling, and I tremble before it. But I know it is the real calling to love. So I ask you to pray for me that I may love God and neighbor as God deserves and as our neighbors deserve. The word has been exposed. Let us now fulfill.